Hey everyone, it is week 5 of the semester. We are a third of the way through this semester. Hard to believe that that's actually the case, but here it is. We're going to dive into the art and architecture of ancient Greece. This is part 1. There'll be a second video, part 2. So let's dive into this, shall we? So when we talk about the art of ancient Greece, we have 3 main periods we're going to take a look at. We have archaic Greece. And understand, archaic in this particular case does not necessarily mean what you might think of it as. Archaic is often used either mean primitive or outdated. And by the way, my window unit air conditioner here in my studio just kicked on. That may happen occasionally while during this lecture. My apologies if you can hear it. Hopefully I am loud enough that you can hear me over that. Specifically, it speaks to the period that came before the classical period of ancient Greece. And here we are, the classical Greece. This is the period that your book refers to as Hellenic Greece. The two are synonymous, Hellenic and classical ancient Greece. The reason I'm going to use classical in this particular lecture is because Hellenic and the next period, Hellenistic, sound so similar to one another. And so for simplicity's sake and to make it easier to understand, differentiate which period we're talking about, I'm going to go with classical and Hellenistic. Ancient Greece is one of the first Western civilizations that we can point to that where art develops in sort of the characteristic manner that it still does today. Specifically, we're talking about one generation looking at the art of generations before, or even cultures that were before them, gleaning from that art what lessons they can, adopting certain ideas, rejecting others, and trying then to advance the craft. Then, after that generation, along comes another generation, and the process begins all over again. And in ancient Greece, visual art follows in the footsteps of every other facet of life for them. That is, it was the pursuit of some sort of ideal. Idealism is generally the philosophy that there's a certain perfection which all things should aspire to, and that perfection is somehow intrinsic. It's not something outside of the thing itself. It is something that one should and can attain. Archaic Greece. During the archaic period, and again, archaic in this case means ancient or the beginning, not necessarily how you might often use it to mean sort of primitive. By no means should one think that the archaic Greeks were primitive, right? But it's during the archaic period that Greek art became less rigidly stylized and more naturalistic. It's very, very heavily influenced by the art of ancient Egypt, and you'll be able to see that. We'll make some comparisons. There were big changes in artistic styles at the time. As I was just saying a moment ago, it became much more less stylized and more naturalistic. Paintings on vases evolved from geometric, abstract designs to representations of humans and human figures, things of that nature, often illustrating epic tales, things of that nature. In sculpture, the faces become animated with what's referred to as the archaic smile. This is a feature, if you will, of archaic Greek sculpture. And there's this growing attention to human proportions and anatomy that we're going to see brought to real fruition in the classical period. The architecture is characterized by the development of the Doric order of architecture. Don't worry, we'll get into that. You'll understand what that means later. And harmonious proportions. They developed these harmonious architectural proportions during archaic Greece, and that would continue into the classical period as well. So let's look at some pottery painting and what developments happened during archaic Greece. First off, we have the geometric period. We'll only look at one example from this period. Right, this was very, very early on in the development of art in the archaic period. And it bugs me that, again, my icons are still showing at the bottom, and you can't see the actual date down there. So my apologies. This is a crater. A crater is a vessel that's used for mixing wine and water. And during this geometric period, artists began to think and create as Greeks. not as Egyptians or Minoans or Mycenaeans. The style begins to develop that is their own. Now, they certainly borrowed from those earlier cultures that we just mentioned, especially ancient Egypt. You're going to see a lot of Egyptian influence on the work. But the result was a recognizable Greek style. We know that the Greeks painted on more than just pottery. However, the rest has been lost to time. So the pottery is the best example that we have of what Greek painting looked like at the time. A lot of it has been restored because even this crater, you can sort of see the cracks and things, and it's been restored. But it gives us an indication of what the painting was like. And as a result, nearly all of our examples of Greek painting from this period are on pottery. Now, you can see here, like, there are certainly things that are being figures and objects that are being represented here. You can point to them and see a horse, a human, things of that nature. But in this geometric period, we find pottery that's decorated like this, with geometric patterning. And though we can point to these figures and be able to name them, they are still very abstract representations of human figures, animals, and they're all in silhouette. Right? Not a lot of interior detail. They're just silhouettes. Greek pottery also contains what are referred to as meanders. This is the decorative borders that are constructed from a continuous line shaped into a repeated motif. A motif, remember from week 1, is something within a work of art that gets repeated. It's an element that gets repeated. And when we talk about meanders, let me see if I get my laser pointer, right? Meanders are lines that are continuous, like one continuous line, like the lines that are being used to make up these sort of diamond shapes, or these meanders that are happening up here in these shapes, right? They're just sort of continue and wander, but are one continuous line and create repeated motifs. They make concentric circles. They make sort of wheel patterns, shaded triangles. There are swastikas. The swastika has been around far longer than the Nazis ever were. The swastika is a visual motif that's been used for much, much, much longer than the past 70 years. Here, that there would not have been those sort of connections to it, and zigzag patterns as well. Time passes in the archaic period, and figurative representation, and when we say figurative, we're talking about the artwork is meant to be more representational. It's meant to look a bit more naturalistic. This is a development, as I said, that happens in the archaic period, and now as we look at the pottery, we see a bit more of a move toward naturalism. With this piece here, Achilles killing the Amazon queen Penthesilea, I believe. We actually have the artist who made this. We have his name there. As you can see, again, a story from mythology. You would recognize this story from the epics of Homer. Pottery at the time was highly valued by the people, and we can see that value in the fact that many potters and artists actually signed their vases. Exekias, I believe. Exekias, I cannot remember. But that's why we know his name, right? He signed this piece of work. Exekias, that's how it's pronounced. I actually have it in my notes here. He was one of many who signed his pottery. The Greeks continued to improve on their pottery techniques during the archaic period and developed two main styles. And if I were in your shoes, I would make a note of these two things. The black figure pottery and red figure pottery. This is what would be referred to as black figure pottery. All right? There's a reddish background with black silhouettes of figures with their details sort of etched in with a stylus, right? Like just sort of scratched in, and then those details are in the same red as the flat red background is. These vase paintings were central to the culture of archaic Greece. We've already mentioned in the last one, but also we see here in this one, we have Achilles and Ajax playing dice. Homeric themes and stories were popular with potters and with those who were purchasing the pottery, as were the stories of ordinary men rising in status. Right? This was a regular theme. The figures are very inspired by and influenced by ancient Egyptian painting. We'll look and compare them soon. But the poses are much more dynamic, rather than those stiff standing poses of a lot of the Egyptian work that we looked at. Here we have Achilles on the left, we have Ajax on the right playing a game of dice. So it's an action scene. There's something happening here. It's not just character, right? There's something happening on it. There's dialogue or interior thoughts that have sort of been written around here. So it's interesting. It's kind of like a comic book in that way, because right, we're getting words that are coming from their mouths. We're getting to read what they're saying, but we're also getting thoughts that are sort of drifting in space above their heads. Large amount of negative space, right? All that red back there. There's a simplicity to the figures, but they're far more naturalistic than anything that we saw in that geometric period. This is what would be referred to as red figure pottery. This is another crater. And red figure pottery is just the opposite. Let's go back. in this particular case, the pottery would have been glazed in the red. Then there would have been an overglaze of the black, and the black would have been scratched into to get those details and to get the red that had been behind it. And in this case, the same thing is happening, but you're scraping away everything that you want except the black. And in this case, the black is in the negative spaces. The black here is in all the places where the red was here, right? So that the black is the etched, detailed line work, and the figures are in red with a black background. Now, again, as I said, and as you can see right here, the paintings of archaic Greece are extremely influenced by ancient Egyptian art, right? You can see the similar treatment of the silhouetted head with the eye that faces outward, the way that the torso is shown from the front. And, there's a lot of things happening here that you can see stylistically as being very informed by what the ancient Egyptians were doing in their paintings. But there are a couple of differences. One, the much more dynamic poses, right? Because the archaic Greek artists here weren't restricted by the necessities that came with painting on the walls of pharaohs and kings and highly important people who needed to have that painting to potentially inhabit should their own body not be good enough for the task, right? So they're not limited by that, so they can put figures in much more dynamic, action-oriented poses. And also, you'll see there's much more of a focus on human anatomy, right? Archaic Greeks are already at this point showing an attention to muscular detail, the muscles underneath the skin, that we're going to see really rise to prominence in the sculpture of the classical and Hellenistic periods. But that obsession is already starting to show itself here. Now, Greek sculpture. With Greek sculpture, and particularly archaic, we see a pursuit of the ideal. Artists were always working to improve their techniques during this time and their sculptures. And you'll see like there's this progression as we go through the years of each generation of artists looking at the ones before them. Archaic Greece is interested in the whole figure, rather than like heads and busts and things of that nature. And they develop two different ways of portraying men and women. All right, so you're going to see two very different treatments for men and for women. Sculptures of men are referred to as kouros, or that's generally a sculpture of a young man. Sculptures of women are called kourei. The men are going to be nude. Understand, the ancient Greeks didn't have the kind of hang-ups with nudity that we have in sort of modern United States. The human figure, particularly the human male figure, was seen as the closest thing to perfection in creation. Sorry, ladies, but that's how the Greeks saw things. They saw the male form as being the closest thing to the ideal perfection when it came to this realm of Earth that we live on. Women, unfortunately, are clothed, at least in the archaic. We're going to see that change as we get into classical and Hellenistic for sure. The men, for male sculpture, the sculptors of archaic Greece adopted this particular type of pose from the Egyptians. We didn't look at any Egyptian sculpture in week one. That was one of the things I cut out of it in order to keep that lecture from going on too long. This pose of striding forward with the left foot, that is something that is very Egyptian, and the archaic Greeks adopted that. The women are portrayed with their feet together and flat on the ground. The men also have their hands at their sides, and that's a very Egyptian thing as well. The women often have one arm at the side and one that's sort of raised in some fashion. And in a lot of ways, that was also taken from the Egyptians. So this would be a kouros. If we compare it to Egyptian statuary at the time, you can see that pose is taken directly from what was referred to as the master pose in ancient Egypt. This was a pose that was meant to show power. So it was usually reserved for the king or someone who was particularly important. And it's arms at the side, very tightly to the side, clenched in fists, with the left foot forward, as if it were striding forward, but standing very upright. And you can see in the kouros here on the left that was adopted. You can also see things within the facial features that are very Egyptian-inspired. Right? The piece is meant to be a sculpture here, however, of a young man, a youth, not a king or someone extremely important. And you can see at least a very budding attention to musculature and in anatomy happening in here. That striding foot forward, there's this sense of motion, as if he's moving forward. And there's tension in the muscles and things of that nature, right? We get the sense of bones existing underneath the muscles. We get sort of an etched-in indication of pectorals and things of that nature, right? But there's still a little bit of that geometry of the geometric period, right? He's still very squared off and angular, right? Not super naturalistic yet. He not yet is he being pushed toward the idealism that we're going to see very soon. Now, it's amazing how quickly it happens. Like each generation comes along. This is a later piece, a later kudos that shows further developments happening, right? The knees and the calves and that the bone being emphasized. There's bone underneath the skin and all that. That's still a thing, right? That's something that we saw happening in this earlier piece. And there's still that master pose, arms tightly at the sides, fists clenched, that left foot forward. But there's more muscle, more attention to trying to have an observational or naturalistic sense to the musculature in the arms and the upper torso, right? Whereas here in the upper torso, and in the arms too for that matter, everything's sort of just surface level, scratched into the surface, sort of hinted at. Here we get a very polished sense of muscle underneath tightened skin. There seems to be an attempt here to portray the body as it is actually seen, and not in that much more, halfway between naturalism and geometric that we saw in the earlier piece. And we can see in the face what is referred to as the archaic smile. The presence of the archaic smile is there, and it feels like a slightly unnatural smile. Right? The archaic smile, we'll see other examples of it as we go along. It literally is just like the lips are tightened together and are curled up almost into a smiley face kind of smile, right? It doesn't look natural. It looks almost like it was just slapped right onto the face. We're not quite certain what the purpose of that archaic smile was. We can't go back in time and ask about that. Right? This is a generation just after the generation that created this statue. We see an artist who's looking back at what came before him, and who is working toward some sort of ideal. When it comes to chores, right, the statuary of women, here's an early one from archaic Greece, and it has everything that we were just talking about. It's female, it's clothed, very different from the nude statue that we saw, the two nude statues that we've seen of men. We see the one arm down, one arm raised, the feet are together, right? The archaic Greece seemed to codify how men and women should be portrayed in sculpture, and there were different rules for each. We can also see, again, sadly, a portion of the face has been lost on this one, but you see that unnatural, weird, upward turned smile, the archaic smile, as it's referred to. It's this unnatural, curved smile. We also see a lot of attention, or rather less attention, being paid to naturalism, and this is very abstracted in nature, very geometric. She's very boxy, angular, a lot of geometry has been etched into the surface of her dress. Her hair is treated in a very abstract nature, right? And again, that pose, as you can see, is very reminiscent of the ancient Egyptians' treatment of women in sculpture as well. Now, move along the generations of sculptors here, and this later Corée, we see a lot more of naturalism happening, and a bit more of a push toward some sort of ideal. Right, now there's still some geometry, right? She's still a little boxy, though less so than the last one. There's a little more of an indication, right, of there being, say, legs beneath the dress. There's still that arm side and one arm up, lifted upward. But there are things like the musculature of the neck and the smoother features of the face that seem to be indicating a sculptor who's a little more interested in observational naturalism. Here is a much closer look at the archaic smile. The archaic smile, again, these upturned corners of the lips themselves bend in a weird, unnatural way. The facial features around the mouth don't seem to respond as if smiling is happening, but the mouth is formed into a smile. And again, we looked at the smoothness of the face. This seems to be a sculptor who may even have a model upon whom he is basing the face of this particular female, this female figure. Also, when we get up close, you can see some kind of rust color that's left on it. It's believed that a lot of Greek statuary, even in the archaic period, we know for sure in the classical and Hellenistic period, but even in the archaic period, it's believed that these statues were painted. And then over the centuries since they were first created, that paint has worn away. There's just remnants of it on this particular piece here. Now we know for certain, again, in classical and Hellenistic Greece, that those statues were painted. But it looks like even as early as the Archaic period, they may have been painting their statuary. Then architecture. Architecture at this time, well, in ancient Greece in particular, and I wonder if I can move my video. I can't move my video. The pinnacle of Greek architecture appears in their temples. And when we look at their temples, we see what is referred to as post-beam triangle construction. Meaning, there are columns. Right? Let me see. Let me use my laser pointer rather than my... come on. Why is my laser pointer not showing up? I guess I will have to use my mouse pointer instead. I don't know why the laser pointer is being weird. We have a column, which acts as a... Now my laser pointer wants to work. Which acts as the post in the post-beam triangle construction. We have a beam. In this case, that would be the frieze, as it's referred to. And a triangle. That would be the roof, or the pediment, as it's referred to here. Some other common features of Greek temples would be the entablature. That's the entire upper portion of the building above the columns. The cornice. That's the horizontal piece that crowns the entablature. The raking cornice up here. That's an angled cornice at the top of the pediment. The stylobate, which is down here, the stylobate, which is that upper step of the steps that lead up to the temple, and it's the one that acts as the base for the columns to sit on. And the capital, which is important for our purposes, which is the top of the column, and what that capital looks like determines the architectural order of that particular building. Now, what do I mean when I say architectural order? Let me let you in on a little secret here. Because there's only really like a fraction of the class who's actually watching these videos like they should be, I decided to give a little reward here to those of you who actually do watch. This right here, what you're about to hear, there is going to be a question on the quiz that will cover this right here. And that question will be on both versions of the quiz and is phrased in such a way that if you Google it, Google gives you the wrong answer. I discovered that a couple semesters back when I was flabbergasted at the number of students who had gotten this question wrong and thought, what is going on? Did I word this question weirdly or what? And then when I took the question and literally typed the question exactly as it appeared on the quiz into Google, it gave me not only a wrong answer, but the wrong answer that a majority of students gave on that question. So, listen well, take some notes during this, so that when this question comes up, you'll be able to answer correctly, because you will not be one of the ones who decided to go to Google and get the wrong answer. All right, back to it. Well, the ancient Greeks developed architectural orders. How do I explain? In archaic Greece specifically, it's the Doric order that develops. This is the Doric. Let's talk about some things here. All right, so for this, we have three different columns for each of the architectural orders. Each one was considered a little more elegant than the one that came before it. The Doric order, you'll notice, has a large fluted column and a very plain capital. Right? There's not really any decoration up there. And it stood directly on top of the stylobate. The capital would be then topped by what are referred to as triglyphs. That's this little bit right here that has essentially three stripes in it, hence triglyph. And metope. This is the metope, as it says down here. Metope. The metope would be this area between triglyphs. Sometimes it would be left blank, but often had relief sculptures that were inside of it. Right? Next comes the Ionic order. You'll notice it has a much more slender shaft. It's considered more graceful, if you will. And the capital is a pair of inverted scrolls. They're scrolling downward. And it's usually topped by a decorative frieze. Right? You don't necessarily see metopes dividing off these. You don't see triglyphs dividing off the frieze into metopes. And the third architectural order, which again came later, each one of these is coming after the one before it, is the Corinthian. Corinthian is the most decorative of the three. It has taller and even more slender columns, and the capital up here is like an inverted bell shape. It comes up and is wider at the top than it is at the bottom, and is usually adorned with sculpted leaves. The Romans later on really liked this, so the ancient Romans are going to adopt the Corinthian order for a lot of their stuff. Now, as I was just mentioning, we have the frieze. Right? The frieze is this portion that sits on top of the columns. It's right on top of the columns. Right? And in a lot of the temples at the time, and particularly in archaic Greece, that's broken up further. There are the triglyphs. Again, there's these little architectural elements right here that have 3 ridges down them, hence triglyph. And the metope, right, which is the space in between triglyphs. Sometimes left blank. Oftentimes, however, it would have contained sculpture of some sort that would have been depicting a story. And then each little metope would be like one frame of the story, if you will. Archaic architecture was Doric, as you can see here in the Temple of Hera. It was not as refined and proportioned as later classical and Hellenistic examples would be, but it was a testament to Greek expansion. This temple right here is actually built in southern Italy, on land that was colonized and was thought of as Greek. Right? The Greeks branched out and started colonizing and conquering areas around them, and they would bring with them their culture to leave their mark. So even though this is not on the Greek peninsula or on any of the Greek islands, this is on the Italian peninsula. There we see that Doric order happening, and this temple of Hera is in ruins. It would have been capped off with all of the different architectural things that we've looked at so far. This is the temple of Aphae. I'm not even going to try. I'm going to screw it up, I'm sure. This became the standard that would then go into Doric temples. Even when we get later on and we take a look at the Parthenon takes a lot of influence from this particular temple. It refined those earlier Doric models and made the columns much more slender. Let's go back. Look at those big fat columns on that one right there. And it would have had what the Greeks thought were mathematically ideal proportions. We won't get into those. You don't need to necessarily know the math, but they had proportions, very specific proportions that they felt were ideal and perfect for a temple. And this becomes then the pinnacle of archaic architecture. And so that's where we'll end it for right now. That's the end of part 1. We finished up talking about archaic Greece. We'll move on in the next lecture to classical Greece and Hellenistic Greece. All right, I'll see you there. Bye.